This isn't your typical boxing strength training video. No, I'm not telling you just take a typical powerlifting program, do west side, just get a stronger squat. Instead, I'm going to take you through from start to finish the why and the how of implementing a strength training program to improve your boxing performance. But first, we need to cover how important is strength to boxing. Now, there are a couple of interesting papers showing that the squat jump, which is essentially a vertical jump but pausing at the bottom of the dip, and the vertical jump explains approximately 78% of punch impact force, meaning the variables that make up, or the physical attributes that make up punch impact force. These two exercises explained the values that were created from these athletes. Similarly, we see the vertical jump tends to correlate well with the number of punches thrown during a simulated sparring bout. Now, this somewhat makes sense because we know that punching impact force is predominantly driven from the legs. So the more powerful our legs are, generally, the harder we'll punch. Now, this doesn't always mean that this is the case. There's obviously limitations to studies like these. For example, punch impact force, just teeing up on a force plate that's stuck on a wall is very different to punching when you're actually sparring or in a match. There's going to be some research potentially coming out soon from Andrew Usher. You can listen to his podcast and we'll get him back on as well, where jumping may not correlate well with punch impact force. Then we have coaches like Gary Hutt with GB Boxing. We have Seth Linetsky, one of the leading punch researchers, talking about strength training in a way that's not just about lifting weights or just about improving jump metrics. Gary Hutt talks about, there are other things more important than the strength training side, even though they do it. It's secondary to, for example, the conditioning and things like that. Then we have Seth Linetsky, also on the podcast. He talks about things like hitting the heavy bag, powerful maximal heavy shots for short durations with complete rest as a way to improve your boxing strength training. There's also other methods, for example, heavy bike sprints. That's your conditioning, but the high resistance is enough to strengthen your legs too. So there's more to this than simply squatting more, benching more, whatever it is to getting strong. But I'm going to take you through a simple way that you can develop your own training program to do this. So why strength train at all as a boxer when you can get a lot of the physical qualities you need out of just doing the sport itself? Well, there's a few reasons you still want to do some sound strength training, and one of them is to reduce the risk of injury. Now, there's some good meta-analysis out there showing that strength training as a modality versus things like stretching can reduce your risk of injury by over 50% over the long term. Obviously, that's not if you're doing really high volume bodybuilding style routines. That might make it a little more difficult. Secondly, we want to address things that we're not getting within the sport. Boxing, depending on the type of boxing, but we're going to focus purely on amateur boxing, as most people who are watching this are likely doing. In the amateur boxing, you have a lot of bouncing around, a lot of high intensity actions, but very little need for maximal force expression. So touching on some of these qualities outside of your boxing training can help you also reduce the risk of injury. And then we have the ability to tolerate training loads. So stronger individuals are typically able to handle higher workloads within training. So if someone's relatively weak, they may not be able to handle the rigors of a very busy training schedule. If you're stronger, you can generally handle these increases or even these spikes in training loads, keeping you healthier for longer. So where do you start when it comes to creating your strength training program? Now, a simple way to figure out that is using simple tests. Now, I'm not talking about just going in and doing random strength tests, getting on 1RM, and then using that, because it doesn't tell you what you need. It just tells you a number of how strong you are in that particular exercise. When I test, I want to know, how does this influence my programming? If I squat 140 kilos versus 130 kilos, is that telling me anything about my program? If I squat a certain number or deadlift a certain number, sure, maybe if it's very light and you're brand new, but you already knew that. So here's a couple of quick tests that you can do. It doesn't take any special equipment. That's why I like them. You can do them at home, at the gym, wherever. So the first one is the eccentric utilization ratio. And this is your ability to use elastic energy well. So think about jumping. If you're trying to jump onto a box, how well can you dip and drive and get up there? Essentially, this is an important skill: punching, moving around the ring, all that stuff. And we also have reactive strength index, RSI, and that is your ability to bounce off the ground rapidly. So that really quick contact with the ground and that rebound, like you're jumping rope. So if you're really good at jumping rope, that's one of those abilities. Now, these two tests can essentially inform where you start with your program. There is another more advanced test like the force velocity profile that can tell you whether you're maybe a force or a velocity dominant athlete. That takes a little more work to do and maybe a little more understanding, so I'll leave that one out for this. But these are really easy to do. You can measure these with jump height using your phone. There are lots of apps out there now. My Jump 2 is one that I like to use, and you can get these jump heights and then make these really simple calculations or measurements. So the first one, the eccentric utilization ratio, it's essentially the difference between the squat jump, which is a jump pausing at the dip, and then the counter movement jump, or also known as the vertical jump, where you don't pause the dip and you just jump as high as you can. Now, when you do these, you typically want to do them with your hands on your hips, so you're isolating the legs. So what you'll do is you'll get the jump height of both exercises, and you're going to take those jump heights, and you're going to take the percentage difference between them. So I have a few examples over here of potentially what could happen. Now, the arbitrary threshold between the two exercises is 10%. So the idea is that if you're over or under 10% dictates what you're going to do. So let's take, for example number 1, squat jump of 25 centimeters and a counter movement jump or a vertical jump of 35 centimeters. We see a 33% difference between the two. So we see that this particular boxer is able to use elastic energy really well. In terms of muscular force generation when jumping, it's not quite there. So for this particular boxer, we might focus more on that muscular force generation when jumping. So you might do more pauses in your lifts. You might do more pauses when you jump, concentric only jumps, things like that, to bring this closer to their counter movement jump. The example 2, they're relatively even. 35 centimeter squat jump, 37 centimeter counter movement jump, 5.5%. In this instance, we need to bring up both qualities, but we're going to focus on still improving that elastic ability, that vertical jump. And then in example 3, we see that the squat jump, 35 centimeters, is higher than the counter movement jump. Now, you will very rarely see this. For example, this would be a 15% difference. Here you would, and then in example 3, we see that the squat jump, 35 centimeters, is higher than the counter movement jump. Now, you will very rarely see this. For example, this would be a 15% difference. Here you would purely focus on building that elastic ability. Lots of various repeated jumps, box jumps, even some forms of plyometrics and the like. Now, as you can see, just from this one test can influence how your program will look just from that number. And that's the idea of doing tests like this. But we also have the RSI, which can help us break down that training even further. So the RSI test uses the drop jump. Now, the drop jump is a skill in itself. So the first few times you do these, you can't take your numbers at face value. You may have to get familiar with the exercise first before really taking the numbers and using them. But essentially, it is the jump height divided by time spent on the ground. Now, this exercise, you're going to actually step off a box. So you're going to stand, typically a 30 centimeter box or 12 inches is the standard. And what you're going to do is you're going to step off the box. As you hit the ground with very minimal knee bend, you're going to jump as high as possible while spending the least amount of time on the floor as possible. And that's important because when you measure this contact time should be under 250 milliseconds or 0.25 seconds. And that's how you know when you're in this domain of reactive strength. If you're hitting the ground and you're taking 400 milliseconds to take off, it is too long for it to be considered reactive strength. Then you're kind of sitting in this eccentric utilization ratio area in terms of jumping instead of plyometric. So that's important to keep track of. Obviously, this RSI number is going to be dictated by both things. If you spend more time on the ground and jump higher, you might get a higher RSI, but that higher RSI might not translate well to boxing because you don't have that much time to produce the force. That's why this metric is such a handy one for sports like boxing. So there are more strategies to improve RSI than just jumping higher. Obviously, you can reduce your ground contact time. If you're able to get down to 150 milliseconds but maintain your jump height, that's a huge win in reactive ability, and your RSI will show it. Now, with your RSI number, there's really good graph on, you just search Reactive Strength Index Flanagan. I'll put a link down in the description. There's a whole table showing where you can rank yourself based on this, and it ends up being anywhere from 1 to 3, and it goes up in 0.5 increments. So if your RSI is low on that table, then you're going to spend a lot of time doing things like pogos, ankle pops, jumping rope, low amplitude plyometric exercise. And those things you're going to do at volume. Think about the extensive plyometric and jump progressions I've posted on this YouTube channel as well. Those are the things that are going to help you improve that contact time, and then you can progress into the more intense variations, hopping over hurdles, the drop jumps like in this test, higher box drop jumps, depth jumps, all those other more advanced plyometrics you can eventually work to. But Always start at the bottom and make progress there first, and then save those more intense variations as that ace up your sleeve. So how do you use these tests to influence your programming? So let's just take an example. Maybe you have a low reactive strength index, a really high eccentric utilization ratio. So you can jump really high when you have the rebound, but when you don't have the rebound, you don't jump so high. And then when you do your reactive bounce, you don't get very high with the short ground contact time. In this instance, you'll be doing a lot of plyometrics, because to bring this up, you need to do a lot of really fast ground contact plyometric exercise. And you might do a little more concentric only jumping, squat jumping style, getting a little stronger. On the flip side, maybe you have the opposite. Maybe you're already very bouncy, but you have a low eccentric utilization ratio. It's probably not that common, but just as an example, here you'll do minimum plyometrics just to maintain this RSI. And because you have a low eccentric utilization ratio, meaning your squat jump and vertical jump are kind of close together, you're going to do a lot more jumping within this style of program. And you can see these two programs can be vastly different just from these two numbers. Now, the pairing I like to use, as like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is the force velocity profile with the RSI, because that's going to tell me exactly how the rest of the program will be structured. Because I can be like, okay, you are a velocity dominant athlete with a high RSI. So you already have the speed and you have the reactive strength. You just don't have the force to improve maximal power. So we'll spend a little more time focusing on the maximal strength side. Whereas if you had the opposite, someone who's very force dominant, didn't have the speed, but maybe they had, even if they still had a high RSI, then you might still do minimal plyos, but you can spend more time doing velocity-based exercises like jumps and throws, etc. So this is just some ways you can think about programming for your strength training outside of just, okay, I'm going to take a powerlifting split or a bodybuilding split or west side conjugate, whatever it is, and doing a shit ton of volume of random things, when you can really dial it down so it's a little more individual. I mean, this isn't the gold standard of programming going to give you the perfect program for you, but it's going to give you somewhere to start. And it's going to give you something where, okay, at least you can attack what you're weak at outside of your boxing training. And then things like this will transfer back into your boxing training as well. So how do we fit this into a session? So I've given a framework here of how you could do a 2-day strength training program for boxing. I'm just giving the categories within these, not the actual exercises or the volume or intensity. That stuff changes depending on the test scores, what you have available, things like that. But this should give you a general understanding. So day 1, day 2, they're exactly the same, but the exercises would change, the volumes would change, and things like that depending. But to give an example, well, this is the way I like to do it. A warm-up circuit, and if you're part of the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground or you want to be part of that, you'll see that all my programs essentially are set out similar to this, especially at the beginning. And I'm also in the middle of creating a 365-day training program for striking and boxing that's already partway through and published on there, which you can do as well alongside Dominate the Ring. Warm-up circuit I like to use, and that's going to be 2 to 3 rounds of 2 to 3 exercises, mobility circuits, things like that, other random things, typically addressing problem areas within boxing or the sport. So it could be things like various shoulder stuff. It could be some various hip flexor work, etc. And because that's done in a circuit, you're going to have that heart rate start to come up. You're going to start to feel a little. Then we have a robustness circuit. I used to call these feel-good circuits back in the day, but Jeffrey Chu, who was on the podcast recently, he's calling them robustness circuits, and I really like that. And essentially, same thing again. You're going to touch on areas that, one, you might not be able to fit in the main program because you're limited on time. You're trying to make sure you get the most out of the actual training program. And 2, you're going to touch on areas or problem areas that you might have. And these could be individual as well. So it's not just maybe problem areas that are specific to boxing, but problem areas that are specific to you. And these things could be low amplitude plyometrics. It could be wrist stuff. It could be neck training. All that stuff would fit in here. And then we'll go into the first main exercise, which is the plyometrics and the throws. So here we're starting from the fastest exercises. So the things that are going to be done at the highest speeds and the highest intent, and moving down to the slow stuff. The plyos and throws, medicine ball throws, plyometrics, various planes, various jumps. Then we're going to go into jumps. Now, jumps here would typically be loaded, depending, but loaded jumps after you've done plyometrics is a great combination. Again, how much you do of all this is going to depend on your scores you got with your eccentric utilization ratio and the RSI. If you have a very low RSI, you're probably going to spend more time around here. If you had a very high RSI, but you also had a semi-decent eccentric utilization ratio, probably going to have a little even split around there, pretty low volume. It's important that you're not doing 6 sets. 6 sets is just too much. We're talking about around, say, 3 sets here, 3 sets here, 2 to 3 sets, 2 to 3 sets, if that, depending. So you've done your jumps, Your heavy lower body, this can be single leg, bilateral, squat, or hip hinge. That depends again on you, what you like to do. Again, reps are low as well. 2 to 5 reps, 2 to 3 sets kind of thing, moving that bar fast. And then just something like a push-pull superset, something simple just to keep your upper body moving and healthy. Now you can finish this depending on time, energy, all that stuff. You could do some extra core work and things like that if you deem it necessary. And the same thing on day 2. The only thing you'll swap around, you might, so for example, this might be a plyo focused day. You might do a more throw focused day there. So you do less plyometrics and more throws. With jumps, you might do loaded jumps here, unloaded jumps there. You might do vertical jumps, horizontal jumps. There's different variations you can use. Your heavy lower body, you might do a squat. Here you might do a hinge. Here you might do a single leg, but here you might do bilateral. There's different variations you can do between that. It's just important to know that you don't need to do everything in a week in one program. So if you just did bilateral squats, and then here you did bilateral Romanian deadlifts, it doesn't mean, oh, I'm not doing any single leg stuff. That's a problem. No. For example, you might do that for 4 to 8 weeks, but then the next cycle, okay, maybe you keep the squat, but you do single leg RDL, for example, and then you start having some more single leg work in there, and you can cycle things in and out. And then the same thing, push-pull, if you want to do core there as well. Now, this would be something that I would use, for example, if you're a beginner intermediate in terms of weight training. Now, I know a lot of martial artists don't have a strong weight training background, and this is where I would start if you fall into that camp. If you've been lifting for a while, you have a decent level of strength, and you know your way around the gym a bit, I'm going to show you an example of how I'd set it up for a more advanced or intermediate advanced weight training boxer. So this is more of an advanced setup or intermediate to advanced setup, but utilizes complex training. That's just pairing heavy strength training exercises with high velocity jumping plyometric style exercises. The idea is it takes advantage of what's called post-activation potentiation enhancement, or PAPE. There's a lot of debate that goes on whether this thing actually exists or not, but regardless, 1, it saves you time, and 2, it's easy to implement. And what becomes an issue with strength training is time and being able to fit everything in. By pairing these exercises, you're able to get both that higher force and that higher velocity component within your training relatively quickly and easily, hence why I really like it. So we start the same on day 1, warm-up circuit, robustness circuit, as mentioned before. We go into maybe a light to moderate loaded jump, and then we get into our contrast, our heavy lower body exercise. For example, squat, single leg, whatever it is, pair that with a plyometric exercise. Now, when you do this, you'll do your heavy lower body exercise. You want to rest typically at least 3 minutes. Obviously, it just depends. Ideally, you want to rest more between the 2 exercises here than you do from the plyometric back to the heavy lifting. So, for example, if you rest, say, 3 to 5 minutes between here, I mean, you might rest 2 to 3 minutes before you go back, because this isn't, you're not trying to potentiate this. You're trying to reduce the fatigue for the plyometric. Now, obviously, in a perfect world, long rest here, long rest here, that's not always possible. So if you are short on time, rest longer between these 2 and then less between here. So think about it almost like you're starting with the plyometric and the superset and then moving to the next thing and then taking a rest. Then into a heavy rotation plus a throw. So that could be, for example, I really like the landmine rotation where you can use your hips with it, or cable rotation, band rotation, whatever it is, with some kind of lighter throw. Could be a medicine ball punch throw, rotational throw, whatever. Then just finishing with some push and pull. Same thing on day 2, but instead of the jumps, you're going to do heavier throws. So this could be scoop tosses, things like that. Then you're going to do another heavy lower body movement. This could be, if that's a squat, that could be a hinge, for example, a Romanian deadlift or a deadlift. Then you're going to pair that with the jump or a plyometric, depending on, again, your test scores. Now, typically, I don't like, if you're doing, say, a heavy back squat on day 1, I typically don't like also doing a deadlift on day 2. Yes, you can call the deadlift to posterior chain exercise, blah, blah, blah. But it's just too similar. And the loads you're using are too similar. The fatigue from heavy deadlifting far exceeds a lot of other exercises. And I don't think you get as much out of it as using a pure hinge exercise like a Romanian deadlift, single leg Romanian deadlift, good morning, etc. I think you're better off, if you're going to do a squat, to do one of those variations. However, if you don't like to squat for whatever reason, which is cool, you could do a heavy deadlift here. Maybe you really like deadlifting. Trap bar deadlift here. And over here, you might do heavy single leg squatting exercises, Bulgarian split squats, whatever it is. I really like that combination too if you don't like to squat. So if you like to squat, you squat, and then you do hip hinge. If you don't like to squat, you do deadlift or trap bar deadlift, and then you do heavy single leg. And in my opinion, that's what works really well. Then finish push-pull and then some abs if you want. So that gives you a general idea of how, I guess, two different ways you can program your training week with strength training when you're boxing. Now, these two can also almost be progression. So the first kind of setup you could use for a while as you get used to those exercises, as you get stronger, faster, whatever it is. And then you can kind of work in something like this. I mean, it also works well if you're going from maybe out of fight camp to in fight camp or fight preparation. Then you might use something like this within fight preparation because it's going to be essentially take less time because you're pairing things up. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of boxing strength training. If you have any questions, please throw them in the comments. You can also check the description. There's the link for the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground. I've got lots more of this within the Warrior Strength course. Within that, it's all part of the community. We've got lots of coaches within that. Obviously, the guys I mentioned at the start of this are in that community too. So you've got access to a range of coaches within that and the courses and also the training programs. Don't forget that. I have Dominate the Ring, which is the hallmark boxing strength training program from Sweet Science of Fighting in there. And I have created a Boxing 365 program that takes you through an entire year of training. So you never have to wonder what you're going to do when you hit the gym. But please like, subscribe, share it, comment, all that good stuff. It helps the YouTube algorithm gods.